Today, of course, we are going to talk about classical music. Classical music in Latin America is probably something that general audiences don't put together. However, classical music or concert music has been present in the continent since the colonial times. The Catholic Church brought the religious music in a very prominent way that was a part of the ritual and was a part of the, let's say, intellectual, cultural colonization of the natives. Also, music was brought for the entertainment of the viceroys and the nobility and all the powerful people in the new towns, parallel, of course, to the arrival of all type of folk music and traditional music for the 99% of the population. But then what we call now classical music was present in Latin America very soon. Very soon and in a very prominent way. Every church, every chapel, every cathedral, of course, would have an orchestra and a choir, and there are not hundreds but thousands of documents, scores, still archived in the cathedrals, in the palaces, in the churches, in the convents, that are nowadays being studied and played again, some of them after 300-400 years of being just in a dusty shelf. Actually, one of the most important phenomena in the classical music today is how European and worldwide Baroque ensembles and orchestras are rediscovering, incorporating these treasures of colonial Latin American music. The other element is that, of course, Latin America has its own culture, but it's also a part of the Western culture. And then the boats were coming to the Americas full with people and knowledge and cultural treasures, and going back to Europe also full of people and culture and cultural treasures. And some of the most competent European composers of the time were hired to come to the Americas and teach to the natives and teach other musicians in the new continent. Also, over time, some of the most competent students and new composers in the Americas were going to go to Europe, especially to France, to Italy, to Germany, that were like the shifting capitals of musical taste over history, to study classical music. And then what happened is that very early, and especially already in the 19th century, there were composers that were doing this trip back and forth between Europe and Latin America. Then we have the music that was brought by the Europeans, learned by the natives. We have the music that was more trendy in the 19th century and that was coming back and forth. Opera, for example. There were Latin American composers, in particular one Mexican and one Brazilian, that were very successful in Italy as opera composers in the 19th century. That now is not remembered by the mainstream, but the works are there and are being revived nowadays. The 19th century was already strong in classical music for Latin America, but this century of classical music in Latin America has been the 20th century. That's the moment in which more Latin American orchestras reach competent levels. That's the moment in which there was more exchange of knowledge, the moment in which more Latin American composers were to study in Europe or in the United States, and the moment in which they started to embrace who they were. Instead of just trying to reproduce the European music, they tried to start to reflect who they were using the techniques and the devices of classical music. That's why we have now, and we remember and we celebrate now composers such as Manuel Ponce, or Heitor Villalobos, or Silvestre Revueltas, or Carlos Chavez, or among the living composers, we have a giant like the Cuban Leo Brouwer. And all these treasures of Latin American music, classical Latin American music, all this magic, all this impressive tradition is what we are going to share with you in this last section of the class. It's often heard that people don't go to a symphonic concert or to the opera, or they don't listen to classical music because they don't understand classical music. Well, I need to break the news for you. There is nothing to understand. There is nothing to be understood. It's exactly the same that listening to popular music. It's just perhaps longer, okay? If you're not a musician, you don't understand what Lady Gaga does, technically. Then if you're not a musician, you don't understand what Lady Gaga does, you don't know what chord she's playing, you don't know what device is she using, and you don't know what Beethoven is doing. If you are a musician, you can tell what Beethoven is doing, you can tell what Lady Gaga, whatever singer you like, and it's exactly the same. If you are a musician, you know what they are doing. If you're not a musician, you just enjoy, relax, and take a mental trip with this beautiful music.